Good evening or good afternoon, Chicago State students. I'm just recording this brief video because the weather is looking really like it's gonna freeze over. I don't want people to drive in this weather if they can help it. I know there's been power outages and people who are having difficulty with driving. So I just wanted to touch base because I know the temperature is going to drop and it's supposed to snow more tonight when we are scheduled to be in class. So I wanted to cover some key points about this week's reading online so you guys could get a better take on how to look at Urban Rage in Bronzeville by Dr. B.J. Bolden, who used to teach at Chicago State. She passed a few years ago. Um, Really wonderful scholar, and I'm enjoying going back to this book in a little bit more detail. And since I have read it before and I'm reading it again, I wanted to share it with you guys and really look at it with the intent of understanding some of the poems that you'll be reading throughout the course. So, there's a few things I want you to keep in mind because it's not written as lyrically as Angela Jackson's work. It's very much a straightforward scholarly work. So there's a few things I want you to keep in mind that Bolden uses as strategies to inform you as a reader. So she definitely, one, looks at historic events, political events, economic history, what's happening in the larger world to kind of underpin what informs Brooks' writing, right? Which is some of the issues that we generally cover in class, but I kept thinking of that when I was reading on page 2, not in the introduction, but in the first 2 pages of the first chapter. So they say, the climate of the 1930s that fueled the Chicago Renaissance was born of two events: the migration of thousands of Southern black agricultural workers, mostly sharecroppers, to Chicago in search of better economic conditions, and the 1929 stock market crash that created the 1930s economic catastrophe, the Great Depression. And then it starts to go into details about the population about Chicago, how factory jobs were a growing presence in the city. And by 1930, the migration started to change, and that's how we developed the Black Belt, um, or what some people call the Black Metropolis. And then further down, they start to talk about the Works Project Administration, the WPA, and the Federal Writers Project, which in many ways sponsored the Chicago Renaissance here in Chicago, which was a host of different black writers, including Richard Wright, uh, Frank Marshall Davis, who's mentioned in the book. And if you're not aware of this, Frank Marshall Davis is also the black poet that in some ways mentored Barack Obama when he was a young boy growing up in Hawaii. Uh, they don't mention that in Dreams from My Father, but indeed it was him. Um, but the good thing is that you see that because of that timeline and things happening in the 1930s, we also had a key librarian who was very, very important named Vivian Harsh. Vivian Harsh was a librarian on the South Side. She was at the Grover Cleveland Hall branch, which is still based on the South Side. It's the same building, the same wood desk that they feature photos of Vivian Harsh in is still there. I saw it, I think maybe last summer or 2 summers ago. I went by there and it's all of the original woodwork is still there. And many of the papers that you want to look for are still in the Chicago Public Library system if you want to go look at the Vivian Harsh collection. And what happened is at this time, of course, there were writers during the Harlem Renaissance who were writing in New York, but this WPA um, underwritten movement here in Chicago in many ways was also supported socially by librarians like Vivian Harsh, who had literary salons here in the city. And she started to accumulate a collection, and that was the beginning of the Harsh Papers, which they don't talk about that in the book. Um, they don't mention a few other writers who were part of the Chicago Renaissance, like I believe it's the editors of Negro Story, which was Fern Gayton. They don't mention her. And I believe Alice Browning was her co-editor. Um, and also, they don't mention Frank Yerby, who ended up writing popular fiction because his short stories got published as part of the Renaissance, but he wasn't really included in the literary works. But he was probably the most financially successful of all of those writers at the time. Um, I know a scholar who's doing work on Frank Yerby right now, so I thought that'd be interesting to add. But other than that, when WPA started to do this work with the help of writers like Arna Bontemps and Horace Caton also began working on a book with St. Clair Drake called The Black Metropolis, which was kind of a compendium of what was Black life like in Chicago. And I know Horace Caton's papers are also in the Chicago Public Library collection. I posted a link to that on Moodle, so if you want to just click through and see a brief description of what's in the boxes, you can maybe see that or look at some of the other Chicago Renaissance files that they had on the short face page for the Chicago Renaissance on CPO. But one of the things, other than looking at the connections between writers and the historic events that were taking place at the time, you also want to look at how does she break down the structure of specific poems? What are the themes in those poems? How do they tie to all of that stuff, right? Because you see them talk about how Gwendolyn Brooks uses forms like sonnets and the rhyme royale and how she's influenced by Chaucer. But this book also talks a lot about how she was influenced by the modernists, whether it's T.S. Eliot or William Carlos Williams, for example, or being in Inez Stark's workshop, which we talked a little bit about with Angela Jackson's biography on Brooks. But you're looking at how are her aesthetics, particularly with Annie Allen, shaped by what she's reading and the writers she wants to be in conversation with in terms of how she writes. And if it helps you, I would say go look at a couple of the poems by William Carlos Williams. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with The Red Wheelbarrow, which is a very tiny poem that's part of his collection, Spring and All. If you know T.S. Eliot, then you probably know The Wasteland, and you probably know The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. But those are works that you can tell they kind of start to get a little bit more esoteric because they're referencing different archetypes. And archetypes are basically old stories that are often told again and again, sometimes through the lens of a myth or a common character that we can all recognize. Like we can all recognize a villain or a hero, or we may recognize Zeus based on the qualities and characteristics we know from Greek mythology, or we recognize Venus or Athena for love and the goddesses of love and war, for example. How do those translate into the modern day, right? And I feel like that's what we see Brooks starting to do in terms of the Black community. She's starting to translate who are the people that we as Black people see every day in the Chicago community, particularly the South Side, and particularly from a particular time period where it was even more intensely segregated than it is now, right? So, In addition to that, as we flip through, you can tell it's organized by book, right? So the first chapter, it's a little bit of biography if we go here, and you get a little bit of history, right? But chapter 2 focuses solely on a street in Bronzeville, which is essentially her first book. Um, I've seen what the first edition looks like. It's got a brick wall and there's little kids playing in front of it, I believe, unless I'm thinking of the other, children's version of the book. I might be thinking of that. But in any case, a street in Bronzeville is a lot of portraitures of different characters who live in her community in Bronzeville, right? So she does a few different things. Bolden does, anyway. She analyzes some of the poems in the collection. She talks to you about how the book was critically received when it got reviewed and people wrote about it. And she starts to talk about how is it in conversation with other writers. So you hear comparisons to Jean Toomer, who wrote Cain, an instrumental text of the Harlem Renaissance. But you also hear these comparisons between Slim Greer, who was a character in Sterling Brown poems. You hear about Jessie B. Simple, which was a character who kind of conveyed these common sense lessons in stories written by Langston Hughes. And I think it's really interesting because they mention all these black male writers in Bolden's book. But again, it points to another point that Bolden comes back to again and again in this book, that Gwendolyn Brooks began to write texts without a black female counterpart as a role model. And I think that's a really important part to even remember now. There's a lot of black women who are writing and publishing today who not only look to Brooks, but you have to understand that Brooks wrote some of these poems, including The Abortion or Queen of the Blues, which they talk about extensively in Bolden's book, before there were black women really getting attention for writing about black women. And I think that's a key point to pull from that. As you go into chapter 3, you see how she gets kind of a bad critical reception for this book that wins the Pulitzer Prize. And Bolden's really interesting because she kind of smoothly transitions into talking about Melvin Tolson's Harlem Gallery, which, if you want a challenging read, I recommend you read Melvin Tolson's Harlem Gallery on your own. There's a paperback edition that contains both iterations of the Harlem Gallery. A lot of people just talk about the first volume of it. The whole thing is worth reading because it's set up so each poem is like a docent taking you through a museum and kind of explaining these different facets of mythology and history and interweaving that with understanding Black life and how do we consume or view Black life, right? So it's really interesting to think about that and how museums kind of just give you a window into observing something from a distance when someone can actually live something, right? So there's kind of that gaze and not wanting to be just gazing but living that's kind of the underpinning of Melvin Tolson's Harlem Gallery. There's an edition of it in paperback with a introduction by Rita Dove. So I recommend Melvin Tolson's Harlem Gallery. But when Bolden talks about it, they're talking about how Tolson's book is overtly complicated, it's not accessible to people, and that's where part of the argument comes up, right? Is Tolson's book, very much like Gwendolyn Brooks' Annie Allen, written for a Black audience? And At that particular point in time, Haki Matabuti, who we know as her cultural son from Angela Jackson's biography, kind of butts up against that point in this book when they talk about his introduction from Gwendolyn Brooks' book, Report from Part 1. So Haki is saying, I don't think this is a book written for Black audiences. I don't think it speaks to our experiences. It doesn't speak in the language of Black people today, so on and so forth. So I think this book is bringing up an interesting question for Tolson and Brooks, which is, what do Black people have permission to write? How are we supposed to write as Black writers? And my response would probably be, whatever you write is Black as a Black writer. You have to give yourself permission to write the story as it comes to you. It does not have to be in the vernacular. You are not limited from using certain words that are in the purview of your vocabulary, whatever is in your vocabulary. But at the time when Annie Allen came out, because she was drawing from these modernist influences, people had questions about that. And the other thing that's interesting in chapter 3 is they also start to talk about how feminists were critical of Brooks increasingly because she did not express an overtly feminist outlook in her writing. Now, as I said earlier, people are not necessarily talking about the abortion. They are not talking about Queen of the Blues. They are not talking about Mabby and her sister, or A Song in the Front Yard where a little girl longs to be like the women in the Night Stockings. All of those things that are definitely women's issues, right? What do women have permission to do and talk about? How are women supposed to be? It's just articulated in a way that is in a Black setting. So it's really interesting to me, particularly when Bolden talks about Alicia Ostreicher's Stealing the Language, which is another critical book. And the thesis behind Ostreicher's book, which I really appreciate too, is that women are always innovators of language. They are forever recreating it and often not getting the credit for doing so. But it's interesting because Bolden notes that they don't talk about Brooks' work until the 60s, after she's become involved with Obasi and the Black arts movement and embraced her Blackness in a different way. When most of those poems that talk about issues of women seem to fall in that time period before the 1960s. And that's not to say she doesn't talk about some of those things in her later work, because she does. The point is that there were these two contending ideologies in many ways, because Black nationalism was not always in agreement with feminism, and it is not even today. In fact, a lot of Black women subscribe to the philosophical idea of womanism, which is more inclusive of race and gender, right? So when you think about those ideas, she's talking about what are the philosophical perspectives that are at odds with Brooks, and who are the people who see where she's coming from. So you have the social, political, historical perspective, which you get some of that from Jackson, but you get it in a more individual, personalized way. Then you have this larger survey with a brief biographical sketch in the beginning and a chapter that tells you a little bit of the same information, but expands out to the larger world and other writers that were writing in the same time as Brooks. So there's that, right? But then you also have the critical reception of her work. Whose work can she be compared to? What are some of her intentions in the work when you start to look at people who interview her and quote her in this work? And how is she growing and expanding over time? So you can kind of almost do an overlapping timeline, since we talked about in class, If you sat down with Jackson's book, you could actually create a timeline of events in her life. And some of the events in Jackson's book don't occur in this book, and vice versa. So you could create an alternate timeline that has events from both books on it to help you map your way through it. You may want to revisit poems that appear in both books, or just even look at poems that get mentioned in both books as you read. I would also say start to look at some of the other writers that she mentions in the book. I'm going to try to bring some texts next week as well that might be helpful in terms of influencing how you want to look at Bolden's book when we finish the last 3 chapters. And hopefully this is giving you some ideas for your capstone or final project. And we can start to brainstorm some possibilities, I think, after we finish this book, because then you'll have a really good idea historically who you're looking at. Like, what does she fit into? What's the world like that she's starting to come from? And as she's starting to burgeon into the writer that we know and love as almost a mythic figure here in Chicago, what is she really like? Right? So, in addition to all that, finish reading Urban Rage in Bronzeville, and you want to look at the assignment sheet, which is up on Moodle now, and try to just go ahead, draft your first paper. I gave you 5 pages. It's really short. You don't have to write about every single chapter in the book. You don't need to summarize the whole book. I would tell you, do not summarize the whole book. Just analyze some aspect of the book. You can quote from different passages throughout the book, but try to pick one main point. Like, I know when we were in class, some of you talked about part of what helped her become the writer that she became was that she had support every step of the way. So you might want to point out different instances of support that Jackson discusses in the book, and how did that support change and evolve over time, and maybe how did that aid and help Brooks in her trajectory to thrive and become the writer that we know and celebrate. So I hope that's helpful in terms of giving you an example. I'll be available on the GChat function on CSU email. And then also you can just email me too. But read the rest of this book. Do your annotation on Jackson's biography of Surprised Queenhood in the New Block Sun. And I hope you enjoy this. Also, copies of Blacks should be in very soon at Third World Press. I called yesterday and they didn't have copies yet, but I'm waiting to hear from them soon. All right, thanks guys. Stay warm, stay off the ice, be safe.